Sorry, y'all. I had made a video, and then I had to like cut it down because I had already made the video. You know what I mean? Like I made a video about Asta, and then I, remade it. Just a minute ago, and I was like, wait, I don't want to remake the same story. So this story is gonna be about Meliodas instead. Meliodas from Seven Deadly Sins. So. And I like to do that on Saturday, right? I like to talk about the new gens on Saturday, newer animes on Saturday. Um, and then, it's also Sunday. Sunday, I like to talk about, Seven Deadly Sins. So it's like almost Sunday and it's still Saturday. So, it's perfect. So the story of Meliodas, as told by Darius the Green Angel. So a long ass time ago, he was born a demon. And he was the son of the Demon King. One of the most powerful entities in the whole series, right? More powerful beings in the whole series. And then he grew to great power as well. He became the leader of the Ten Commandments. Meliodas of benevolence. He had that commandment. And he ran around leading the Ten Commandments. People feared Meliodas. In the demon world and in the human world. But things changed one day. Meliodas grew close to a woman, of the goddess clan. Her name was Elizabeth. She was the daughter of the great deity of the goddess clan. And that was her mother. The great deity of the goddess clan and then the king of the demon race were at odds with each other. They started a holy war 3,000 years ago. And Meliodas was fighting, to make them stop fighting against one another. Ladosiel and Samiel and Tariel, they all were there. They were present that day. Also, there were some Ten Commandments there. Galan, Darius, Speed. But by that time, Meliodas had defected. He was not a part of the Ten Commandments anymore. He even suppressed his demon energy to a great degree, where he looked like a nice little boy, with, blonde hair. He looked like that, right? So the humans wouldn't, be like, oh shit, that's, the, Demon King's son, he's gonna kill us. And then he's like, no, I'm here to help you guys out and stuff. It's cool. And he was there to help them out. He didn't want to see them, fighting and shit. He wanted to leave the Ten Commandments on, not the worst terms, you know what I'm saying? I'm not fucking with you guys anymore, but I don't want to see you guys, die and go to war with each other, that type of thing. And Meliodas was trying to do that, along with Elizabeth, trying to tell the goddess clan to chill the fuck out too. But, Ladosiel still went on with his thing. And he killed Darius' sister and also a whole bunch of other demons. Trapped them. And then Ladosiel killed them, with a certain, purifying light spell. In doing that, Darius and Monspeed attacked Ladosiel, and Ladosiel, fired back. Zeldris then came to the rescue of those demons, right? Zeldris is the brother of Meliodas, Zeldris of piety, right? And he came to the, aid of those other demons, because he was the new, leader of them. But, during this time, something, had happened, too. With Meliodas, he was said to, walk forever, alone, away from Elizabeth, the one he loved. She would die and be reincarnated every time they met. Every time Meliodas meets Elizabeth in her reincarnated state, she would then die. Because she would remember that she's Elizabeth and she always been with Meliodas or had a thing for him and shit. So every time that happened, um, you know, every time that happened, right, she would then, pass away. She would die. And Meliodas would continue on living, you know, like keeping his youth and everything else. He looked the same as he did, 3,000 years ago as he did in the current time. He never gets old. But, and then he loses his emotions every time he does die. He can come back, but he loses his emotions and he becomes more like a demon and less like, a suppressed demon, human type person like he is. But, during that first Holy War too, a key thing is, that I was trying to say too, a guy named Gother who was a human and then became a demon because he was, he had the commandment. Which commandment did he have though? I'm trying to remember. Fuck, which one did Gother had? The one of, I don't remember what his commandment was, but he had the ability to change everybody's mind about what actually happened. So what happened was Esterosa killed Mael, the most powerful archangel. And that was in the minds of the archangels. Their brother had died to this person named Esterosa. Esterosa was a demon who was the younger brother of Meliodas and Zeldris, and they both, knew of Meliodas as their brother. And that's how, all their memories were, uh, screwed with. And then the demon clan was sealed away and the goddess clan was also sealed away. And then the only races that there were the humans and the fairies and the giants. And then things kept, going, right? Meliodas kept meeting Elizabeth. She kept dying. And then, one day, Meliodas, he created a group eventually. But that would come after he met Elizabeth again, right? He had met Elizabeth when he was... So he met Elizabeth when he was... Or not Elizabeth, but she went by Liz. But he knew it was Elizabeth. They were magic knights for the kingdom of Danafal, right? I think that's what it was called. The demon named Frowdrin was still running around. He wasn't sealed away with the other 10 commandments. He was going to use all those lives in Danafal as like a sacrifice. I sacrifice all these human beings so that then the 10 commandments can come back. But in doing that, nothing happened. Elizabeth ended up dying, and then Meliodas lost his mind and destroyed the kingdom. But then he suppressed his energy and he went to the kingdom of Leonis, right? And then he became one of the 7 deadly sins, the dragon sin of wrath. And then he recruited some other people, Bond the Fox and Agreed, and, Merlin, the sin of gluttony, more sin of gluttony. She, actually knew Meliodas from back in the day too, because she was the daughter of Belialine, a wizard, and she also, obtained magic from the goddess clan and the demon clan, and she became the most powerful mage. She she had helped Meliodas out, right? And then there was also, who else? King, the sin of sauce, and then Gotha, the sin of lust, um, Deanne, the sin of envy, sin of envy for Deanne, and then the sin of pride was Escanor, and he collected all these people, and they were the seven deadly sins, and they were running around Leonis as like their best knights, protecting him. But then Zaratros died, which was one of the Grand Masters. He was also friends with two young Magic Knights, and they, in training and shit, Griamore and, Hauser, but especially Gilthunder, Gilthunder, but it was said that Meliodas killed, Zaratros with the other seven deadly sins, and then they became wanted criminals in the land of Leonis. For 10 years, they had to be in hiding. Meliodas did know about Elizabeth, because after Elizabeth, or the other Elizabeth, died in Danafal, years prior, that he brought her to Leonis, and that's how he became, also, a knight. But then, 10 years ago, he became a, criminal, because, people framed them, and then they were the seven deadly sins, wanted, throughout the land. Meliodas looked like a kid, and other people had their disguises, or they were caught. Bond was caught, but he didn't give a fuck, because he could escape anytime he wanted to. And then, at the beginning of the seven deadly sins, he was looking for his friends again, and they were gonna go back and basically clear their names. They're good guys. They ain't the enemy. He's just a guy, that owns a bar, or wants to, and does. He met Elizabeth, again. She was older now. She was older now, and he, could see her. They went on the adventure together. So after that happened, Meliodas was looking for the rest of the seven deadly sins. They first recruited Bond, the Fox in it Greed. He's kind of like the right-hand man of the group. So they found him and recruited him, and they were cool. Meliodas' powers are still pretty suppressed at this point. Gil Thunder, he threw an arrow, or not an arrow, a spear towards Meliodas. Meliodas caught it, threw it back, letting him know that he was still alive. And Gil Thunder knew Meliodas was still alive, because only Meliodas could do some shit like that. Catch a spear, throw it back with more power than he had, on it. And then they found Cain. King was then found, when King was found, um, King was found, they were fighting, they being, Bond and, King, they were fighting because, his sister had died a long time ago and it was Bond's fault. But Meliodas was like, hey, I don't need to recruit you, King. We were part of a team, we gotta get along and shit. And then they were like, okay, I guess I can get along with him. Then they all got together. They found Deanne. Deanne was, missing the captain. She was like, oh, Captain, you're back. And he's like, yeah, we gotta get back together and, form the group back again and, save Leonis. Um, so they ended up recruiting like the rest of the citizens. They fought in a tournament in this one town. He met an old man who was at Danafall. He was actually one of the knights there, and he was like, did you ever betray us, Meliodas? Did you actually, do that on purpose? Did you destroy Danafall because you wanted to? And he was like, no, I didn't. I, still, was, with you guys and everything. Shit just got out of hand. And then, eventually, a guy named Helbram showed up. Helbram's actually an elf, but he took a disguise of a human. And he fought against Meliodas. Meliodas was sealed away inside of a little thing by the new generation, being Jericho and Gilda. And, he had, dismissed those bitches before, but they were, like, more powerful because they took steroids, demon steroids. And so they were, like, a little more powerful when they trapped him in the thing. But then he came out with the real demon energy and, popped out, and then Helbram fought against him. Helbram had to get help from humans. Humans had to give them their magical power so he could, put Meliodas down. Meliodas got back up, though, and they went back to the Kingdom of Leonis, where Hendrickson was trying to become a demon of the highest class. He was like, the new generation's, proven to be, decent. But then they were becoming, like, demons and shit, and they were like, oh, fuck, this shit is like not good. We can't do this. It has side effects, is what I'm saying. And he's like, I don't care. I need to do this. They ended up fighting against Hendrickson, the Seven Deadly Sins. Meliodas still wasn't at full power at all during this whole fucking time. He he ended up defeating Hendrickson with the help of the Seven Deadly Sins that were present. All of them were present. Gother, King, Merlin, Deanne, Bond, and Meliodas, and also, Elizabeth was there too for support. Revenge counter and defeated, Henderson. But that was only the beginning because the coffin of eternal darkness was opened by Fraudrin. He had took over the body of Mr. Dreyfus. Dreyfus, had Fraudrin inside of his body for 10 years, a whole fucking decade and stuff, right? He released the other 10 commandments, and they came forward in season 2. And when that happened, they were all like, damn, we gotta get stronger, more powerful. They attacked the Kingdom of Leonis, and they were on the back foot, y'all. Galand had them, like, petrified, certain ones petrified, because his commandment's truth, so if you tell a lie, then you become stone. And then Melascula was also there, and other things. And, Meliodas was like, we have to find our last member, because he's actually, like, on par with me. Even when I'm in my, like, higher forms, he's like, he can keep up with me a little bit, So then he was like, they ended up looking for Escanor. But Meliodas ended up, going to the Goddess Clan members, and they ended up increasing his powers. But he had to relive the moment that he didn't like when the previous Elizabeth incarnation ended up dying, right? Boom. He had to keep reliving Danafall until he accepted what happened. And then he could, like, move forward with, like, newfound powers, right? And he was more powerful from that, but not powerful enough, I guess, because, the Ten Commandments, he was fighting against them by himself, you know. And then Astaroth showed up and plugged, killed all 7 of his hearts, because demons have 7 hearts, and he killed all of them. And then he died, and he went back to the demon world. His father was like, every time you die and come back, your emotions are taken and stripped from you, and you become more like a demon. And he's like, oh, I'll be all right, I'll keep coming back, and if this happens again, I'll come back, you know. And then he ended up going back to the kingdom, where everything was being taken care of by Escanor. Escanor fought against Estarossa, dismissed Estarossa and Zeldris. But he came back, and, people were better. But Dreyfus was still controlled, and he's like, yo, get the fuck out of Dreyfus, Leave that man the fuck alone. You've been fucking with him for 10 years and shit. You gotta stay the fuck away from him. Fraudrin, little bitch Fraudrin, and he, he, went and he fucked Fraudrin ass up. He killed Fraudrin, actually. But, he enjoyed doing it, too. It was the, thrill of, fighting and shit like a demon again, kind of, too, that took over. And he was like, Elizabeth, I'm going to become a demon again. And he was, letting her know. But in season 3, the Ten Commandments are still out there. They have actually took over Camelot. And then Meliodas had to, go after these animals and shit, right? And he was protecting, people in villages, and the 7 deadly sins were doing that. But then, he was like, okay, we're going to take them on, right? He confronted Melascula. He got put in a cocoon. And when that happened, the, miasma and all the demonic energy around him, forced him into his, old self. When he was, the leader of the 10 Commandments, and he had to fight against Escanor. And he was fighting Escanor pretty damn good, and he was actually going to beat Escanor. However, Escanor had 1 minute to pull off the one transformation. At high noon, he would be, the most powerful thing on the planet, and nothing could stand in his way. For 1 whole minute, he was the one. He used that divine Escanor move. He was like, divine sword Escanor. And he cut Meliodas, and he was like, oh, you actually beat me and shit. And he was beat. But he was still in that form. He was still, fully demonic and shit like he used to be. And then he was like, I'm going to become the Demon King and save Elizabeth. Because Elizabeth remembered her past. She started to remember her past. Because her eyes, she took on the angel eyes. The, 3 little, how those angel eyes are. The yellow glowing eyes that the angels have. And she, her eyes took on that form. And when that happened, he was like, oh shit, she remembers her, memories and shit. He's like, I'm going to become the Demon King and, take those powers. He fought against Arthur. He was like, I don't give a fuck as long as I become the Demon King. You need to stay the fuck away from me. I'm taking the demon powers from these demons that are here. These are my brothers, and they're going to do what I say. He put them down, and he was just like, he weighed them down with, gravity and shit, Esteros and Zeldris. And then he was like, give me all the commandments you have, and then go hunt the other ones down. And he was like, and then he was inside of a cocoon, so he could, absorb all the energy. Now, when this was going on, they understood that the real Meliodas, his emotions or whatever, was stuck in another place, in purgatory. Belly Elohim had went to purgatory before, and he came back kicked out. Because time there is different than time, in regular time. It could be hot, it could be cold, and then you can age rapidly there. But Bon was like, I'm going in because I'm immortal. And he's an immortal human, so anything that purgatory could throw at him, he could, handle that shit. Because he'll just recoup himself. And then he went into purgatory to find Meliodas. Meliodas was in purgatory, eating food and shit. And, Bon was searching for I don't know how long. But like it was a long, it felt like a long time, but it was like, not really a long time, because it's purgatory, it's another realm of existence. And he was looking for Meliodas, and they found each other, and they found Hog's brother, right? Hawk's brother, and they ended up telling stories and shit, and they're like, yeah, your brother's alive on the other side, and you should meet each other one day and other things. They went back, or they tried to go back. Meliodas was taken by his father and held, and then his father was like, I'm gonna steal your body when you take those 10 commandments in, because that's half of my abilities manifested in the human world. I can then take over your body because it's half of my energy already, and he's like, I'm taking over Meliodas' body. And he did. He took over Meliodas' body, and Bon was like, damn, and the other seven deadly sins were fighting against Esterosa. Esterosa became Mael again because he remembered who he actually was. And he kind of like hated himself for like allowing that shit to happen. But Gotha was like, I was the one that did that to you, and it's not your fault. You're still Mael and everything else. You still have to, do your job and help us out, you know, against the Demon King, or else, everything will, fall apart. You have the ability to change it right now because you're still who you, used to be. And then, they went to go fight against the demons and shit, and Mael fought against the other demons, right? But Bon fought against Meliodas, and they ended up waking Meliodas up. Now, the Demon King had another son, which was Zeldris, right? I told you about Zeldris. He was actually Meliodas' brother, not like Esterosa, who wasn't, you know. They fought against Demon King Zeldris. Meliodas had to go inside of his brother's body and be like, hey, get your body back. It's your body, not his, and then the Demon King manifested forward again, and, the seven deadly sins defeated him. Meliodas went into his most powerful form and, cut his father down. And after a while, you know, king of the, King of Britannia, or not Britannia, but, Leona said, hey, you can have my daughter, Elizabeth Meliodas, and you can be the king. And he became king. And now in the 7 Nights of the Apocalypse, Meliodas is making sure that the 7 Nights are cool. And he's the king of Leonis, so he's also watching over his kingdom as the king. His son's actually one of the 4 knights as a seraphim, Nephilim, whatever the fuck you want to call it, the half angel, half demon hybrid. But Meliodas is still alive, still kicking, and still looks the same, just like he does on the thumbnail and shit. I actually like Meliodas. He's kind of cool, but and he's powerful too. But be cool on the corner, and that was the life of Meliodas as told by Darius the Green Angel.